Okay, well, welcome to the Stanford Digital Economy Lunch Lab Seminar. I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, and today's seminar speaker is Daniel Susskind. Daniel is a research professor in economics at King's College London and a senior research associate at the Institute for Ethics in AI at Oxford University. He's the author of one of my favorite books, World Without Work, and he's a former Kennedy Scholar at Harvard University. He's held numerous posts in the British government, including the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, the Cabinet Office, and the Policy Unit at 10 Downing Street. We welcome and encourage questions during the seminar. If you're in the Zoom audience, please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And for those of you who are here at Stanford, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Be prepared to ask a question so the virtual audience can hear you too. So with that, Daniel, thanks for traveling all the way from the UK and welcome to Stanford. And please tell us about Growth, a Reckoning.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and thank you for the invitation to join you here at Stanford. A great pleasure to be here this lunchtime to talk to you about my new book, Growth, Reckoning. And let's dive straight in. 3 facts, simple but really remarkable, have defined the economic history of human beings until now. The first is that for most of the 300,000 years that human beings have been around, economic life was stagnant. Whether you were a hunter-gatherer in the Stone Age or someone from the 18th century laboring away, you're likely to have lived a stagnant economic life, stuck in an unforgiving struggle for subsistence. The second fact is that it was only very recently that this stagnation came to an end. Modern economic growth began just 200 years ago. And the third fact is that human beings have managed to maintain their economic ascent. Whenever growth had happened in earlier centuries, it had been limited and fizzled out. But this time it was both significant and sustained, as if some long pent-up productive power had finally been unleashed. Now, the first part of the book is about this extraordinary history and this very recent escape. Why there was no growth for so long, why it suddenly began, and how it has been sustained. The second part of the book is about how the pursuit of growth came to occupy such a central role in economic life. Today we live in societies that prioritize growth, where our collective success is determined by how much stuff we're able to produce in a given amount of time, whether GDP has gone up or down. But what's fascinating is that before the 1950s, almost no politicians, policymakers, economists, anyone was talking about the idea of economic growth. And I think this is what this Google engram captures quite nicely. Economic growth is barely mentioned in print publications before 1950. And most importantly, even if we had wanted to pursue growth, it would have been impossible to do so. Before the 1940s, there wasn't really a reliable way to know the size of the economy, whether it was growing, and by how much. Now, as time has passed, we've used this extraordinary material prosperity to achieve a remarkable set of outcomes, freeing billions from the struggle for subsistence that haunted our ancestors, making the average human life longer and healthier than ever before, funding discoveries that have transformed our understanding of the world, splitting the atom, cracking the genetic code, starting to explore the stars. But it's also increasingly clear that this pursuit of prosperity has come at an enormous price: the destruction of the natural environment, the desolation of local cultures and communities, the emergence of vast inequalities between those who have received the greatest share of this wealth and those who have not, the creation of technologies like AI whose disruptive effects on work and politics it's not clear yet that we can properly control. And so growth now presents us with a dilemma that on the one hand, it's associated with many of our greatest triumphs, but on the other hand, it's also associated with many of the greatest problems that we confront today. And the third part of the book explores this growth dilemma, setting out the extraordinary promise of growth, that it's associated with almost every measure of human flourishing, but also the extraordinary price as well, that it's behind many of our greatest challenges too. What I want to do this afternoon, though, is actually focus less on the history, the first half of the book, and far more in the future, the second half of the book, what we should actually do, how to address this growth dilemma in the real world. Now, one response is the pretty blunt demand that the so-called degrowth movement is famous for supposedly making. If growth is the problem, then less growth seems to be their solution. And this is going to be the starting point. But in what follows, I'm going to argue that this is a mistake, indeed a catastrophic one. Instead, that I'm going to argue we need more growth. And the key insight here, and one I return to again and again in the book, is that what really matters in driving economic growth is the discovery of new ideas about the world, and as a result, the technological progress that creates. But I also want to argue that we should use all the tools at our disposal to make it a different type of growth as well. Simply plowing on ahead with more growth alone would be to repeat the mistakes of the past. Finally, though, I want to raise the question as to whether or not we necessarily can change the nature of growth and what we ought to do if we cannot. So that's the plan. Let's begin. So how should we respond to this growth dilemma? It's clear, I think, we can't continue as we have in the past. So should we then simply slow down the growth of our economies or even shrink them? And that is, as I said, the demand that the degrowth movement is famous for supposedly making. If growth is the problem, then less growth of some sort seems to be their solution, and in particular, negative GDP growth. And I think it's important to explore this idea. To begin with, the idea is increasingly influential. Interest in it might have begun among a small group of ecologically minded academics, but it's now spread far beyond the boundaries of their conversation. So in the UK, you have politicians like Caroline Lucas, environmentalists like David Attenborough, activists like Greta Thunberg, all appealing in different ways to this idea of degrowth. And I think it's also the case that the confusions involved in this degrowth discussion turn out to be quite useful. Many of them reflect fundamental misunderstandings about the economics of growth. And I think resolving them can help us sidestep similar mistakes when thinking about the future. So what actually is this idea of degrowth? I think one of the big frustrations is that when you look closer, it's quite hard to tell. And so I think a useful starting point is to look at how the idea is actually used in practice by its supporters. And when you do this, what you see are two related schools of thought. The first is that there are lots of people who turn to degrowth for a diagnosis of what has gone wrong in the world. And then there's those who believe that degrowth provides a good solution to that problem as well. So I just want to look briefly at each of these in turn. To start with, take the degrowth movement's diagnosis. I think the great articulation of this was Greta Thunberg at the 2019 United Nations Climate Action Summit, where she stood up and said, "My message is we will be watching you. You've stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?" Now, I think the first part of this is essentially another way of saying that our current growth path is unsustainable. And I think the first part of this diagnosis is relatively unimpeachable. If anything, degrowthers with their typical focus on the climate probably underestimate the full price of growth. The argument that I make in the book is that growth isn't just causing issues for the climate, but it's also creating and broadening inequalities in society. It is threatening the availability of good work, it's undermining our politics, and it's disrupting local places and communities. But there's also another part to the degrowth diagnosis, and this is this more provocative claim that continued growth is somehow infeasible as well. And this belief has appeared in various forms over time, but it's gradually been sanded down into, and standardized into a popular slogan that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. And you hear this a lot more, particularly among the environmental movement. And I think unlike the first part of the diagnosis, this is just wrong. That effectively infinite growth is possible on a finite planet. And I think a big part of the problem is that this idea of a finite planet is rooted in a pretty old-fashioned view of economic activity. I think the origins of this disposition are pretty understandable. When the founding fathers of the field, Malthus, Smith, Ricardo, Mill, Marx, were working in the 18th and 19th centuries, the British economy around them was overwhelmingly made up of farms and factories. People worked with their hands. They used tools and machines. Inputs into and out of production could easily be counted. And it's true that in a solely material world, there are obvious physical limits on economic activity. Only so many acres of land that can be farmed, only so much raw material for production. But just focusing on the material world distracts us from how growth actually works. Now, growth doesn't come from using more and more finite resources, as many tend to assume, more land, more people, more raw materials, and so on. But growth comes instead from discovering ever more productive ways of combining our finite resources. In other words, growth comes from technological progress. So another way to think about this is that growth doesn't come from the world of tangible objects, the things we can see and touch and drop on our feet, but from the intangible world of ideas. What do I mean by ideas? I mean recipes or instructions for organizing the atoms in the world, or more prosaically, recipes or instructions for making more productive use of the finite resources that we have. And the key point here is that whereas the planet of tangible resources might be finite, as degrowthers say, the universe of those intangible ideas is just unimaginably vast, for all practical purposes as good as infinite. Paul Romer has a great way of seeing this. He says, imagine a kitchen larder. Imagine the kitchen larder is well stocked. It has 300 ingredients in it. Now, there are finite ingredients in this larder, but there are more possible recipes for combining those ingredients than there are atoms in the universe. And exactly the same argument, it seems to me, applies when thinking about the economics of growth, where we're dealing not with ingredients in a larder, but quite literally all the materials in the world. Then there's degrowth as a solution. And I think if we understand it as before to involve intentionally stopping the growth of the global economy or just shrinking it outright, then in my view, it really would be one of the most misplaced acts of self-harm that humankind could inflict upon itself. As the economist Branko Milanovic points out, if degrowth means freezing global GDP per head at its current levels, that would either imply abandoning 800 million people to extreme poverty forever, and if you think that's unacceptable, then the only alternative is going to be finding a way to slash the incomes of the 7.1 billion people that remain, including practically all of the Western population. So I think the key point, and it's a sort of the spirit of the book, is that economic growth has been revolutionary and it's improved our lives in many ways, but it's also an unfinished revolution. And this, I think, is what the degrowth movement just so often fails to appreciate. It's just so extraordinarily unimaginative to believe that our current economic lot is the best that we can collectively do. To imagine that the present moment is some sort of economic peak and that humankind ought to press pause on growth, not just for the next 10 years or the next 100 years, but for all time to come. So my starting point is that we need more growth. If growth were to fizzle out, it would be a catastrophe. And so the big question is how? How do we generate more growth? And I think what's interesting is that although policymakers and politicians talk very confidently today about the causes of growth, I think this general sense of assuredness is actually often at odds with the comparatively little we actually know about the causes of growth. I thought Helpman put it well when he said, for centuries, economists have been preoccupied with the growth of nations, but the subject has proved elusive and many mysteries remain. So that said, I think nevertheless, it's possible to draw out one fundamental lesson from all this work that we've done on the economics of growth, and it's this, which is, and this again is a sort of key argument of the book, that more growth is driven by technological progress, and that technological progress in turn comes from the discovery of more ideas about the world, more ideas about how we can use the finite resources that we have more efficiently and more effectively. So the big question then is, how do we do that? And I think there are four key things that we can do. The first is overhaul who owns and controls those ideas, the intellectual property regime. The second is invest vastly more in research and development. The third is help far more people into the parts of the economy that are responsible for generating these ideas. And finally, we ought to use technology itself to help us generate ideas too. And I think taken together, these four things are fundamental for thinking about how we get more growth. And I hope in the discussion we can perhaps talk about some of these a bit more. But just let me say a little on one or two of these. Take research and development. Here's R&D intensity. So R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP. At the vanguard is Israel, investing about 5.4% of its GDP every year in research and development. Here in the US, something like 3.5%. The average OECD country manages barely half of what Israel managed to achieve. And back home in the UK, we are wallowing around a third of what Israel is able to invest. Now, but what I find interesting, though, is that when you take that 5.4% that Israel invests every year in R&D and compare it with what leading technology companies invest as a percentage of their revenue, it's really quite striking. So Alphabet invests 15.1% of their revenue each year in R&D, Huawei 15.9%, Microsoft 13%, Facebook 21%. Now, of course, countries aren't companies, but it gives you a flavor of what it looks like, I think, to take R&D very seriously. I think the most radical of the proposals in the work, though, is about how we might use technology itself to help us generate new ideas about the world. I think one example of this is the field of AI-enabled drug discovery. It was in its infancy only a few years ago, and now it's pretty well established. So during the pandemic, as many of you know, Moderna was celebrated for using AI to help it generate its COVID-19 vaccine. I think one of my favorite examples, though, of the sort of technology-based idea discovery is AlphaFold, in particular AlphaFold 2. So in 2020, again, as many of you I'm sure will know, it solves the protein folding problem. The protein folding problem was once thought of as being the sort of Fermat's last theorem of computational biology. We have hundreds of thousands of proteins in our body. There's millions of them outside in the world. If we want to, elsewhere in the natural world, if we want to understand how diseases work and how to effectively treat them, we need to know the 3D shape of proteins. And actually predicting the 3D shape of proteins from what we know about them is very, very difficult. It's said that it would take an average PhD student in computational biology their entire PhD to calculate just the shape of one 3D protein. And yet what AlphaFold 2 has done, and now 3, has essentially solved the protein folding problem. So it's able to calculate the 3D shape of millions of proteins in a matter of minutes. And it's likely that this will transform our understanding of disease and treatment in years to come. So the starting point then, I think, is that we need more growth. If growth were to fizzle out, it would be a catastrophe. But the growth dilemma can't be solved by that alone. It's going to get worse if we simply plow on in pursuit of more prosperity and ignore the costs of doing so. So in my view, we've also got to use every tool at our disposal to change the nature of that growth as well, to pursue a different type of growth. And I think a really good example of how this might happen is to think about one dimension of the price of growth, which is the impact that it has on the climate. So if you go back to 2007 and look at the Stern Review, written by Sir Nicholas Stern on the economics of climate change, the sort of first report of its kind, one of the central conclusions in that report was that the cost of reducing CO2 emissions by 80% would be 1% of GDP a year. So in other words, there was a serious trade-off between growth and the climate. If you wanted to protect the climate, you had to reduce growth. The next year, Nicholas Stern, report's author, comes forward and says, no, I got it wrong. Climate change is worse than I thought. It's actually going to cost us 2% of GDP. So the trade-off between growth and the climate had become worse. If you wanted to protect the climate, you had to pay a higher price in terms of growth. You had to give up even more growth. Fast forward, though, to 2020, and what's really interesting is that if you look at the work done by the UK's Climate Change Committee, so the team of experts tasked with advising the British government, they found that the cost of eliminating emissions, so not simply reducing them by 80%, but eliminating them, had fallen to just 0.5% of GDP a year. In other words, the trade-off between growth and the environment had dramatically improved. You had to give up far less growth than feared 15 years ago to protect the climate. And so the big question is why? And the answer is that because technological progress, particularly in the world of renewable energy, means it's now possible to grow the economy without causing as much harm to the climate. More specifically, the accumulation of 2 decades of interventions, taxes and subsidies, rules and regulations, social norms, just completely transform the incentives that people faced. creating an extremely strong incentive in society for entrepreneurs and inventors, not simply to develop new technologies, which, as we saw, drive growth, but to develop technologies, to develop particular types of technologies, ones that did less harm to the environment, and in turn for companies and households to adopt them. So the result was not simply a technological revolution, but it was a green technological revolution. And I think solar energy is probably the great example of this type of technological progress that took place. So in the beginning, in the 1970s, it starts as a sort of tool of last resort to generate electricity in sort of isolated lighthouses and outer space. And yet today, it's completely commonplace. Why is it completely commonplace? Well, there was an exponential decline in the cost of solar modules from about $100 per watt in 1976 to half a dollar per watt today. And as a result, an exponential increase in their uptake as well. And so the consequence has been in practice is that growth is now greener than ever. More and more countries are able to grow and reduce their emissions at the same time. And I think this is a nice way of seeing the general argument that I'm making, which is that by changing the incentives that people face in society, we can not only encourage them to develop new technologies, but to develop particular types of technology. So, another example which is closer to home for me is thinking about the impact that particular technology, in particular AI, has on the availability of work. This, I think, is arguably an example where we have the incentives in the wrong place at the moment. So every year since 1981, the effective tax rate that business leaders in the US must pay to hire workers has been far higher than the effective tax rate that business leaders have to pay to use machines. And so the result is, at the margin, a strong incentive to develop technologies that replace workers rather than make them better at their jobs. And that's the sort of incentive that, if we want to, we could reverse and encourage the development of technologies that augment rather than sideline workers. And as a result, change the nature of the economic growth that takes place. Now, I think one reaction to this is that this idea that we can change the nature of growth by changing incentives that people face is that it might sound a little ambitious. And I think the great example of a really radical incentive in action is if we think about what happened during the pandemic. Practically overnight, billions of people wake up and find themselves unable to go to work. And from an economic point of view, one way to think about this is that the consequence was the price of work soared. In effect, lockdowns set the wage for most in-person work at infinity. No matter how much you might have offered to pay a person, they would have been unable to go to work, not only because it was dangerous, but because in many cases the law simply forbid it. And in thinking about the idea of changing the direction of technological progress, I think this catastrophe was quite revealing. To begin with, these infinite wages drove employers to rapidly adopt technologies, existing technologies, that allow people to work remotely: Zoom, Teams, Skype, and so on. And that's what's captured in this figure here. So the percentage of paid full days work from home increases from about 5% before the pandemic to more than 60% at its peak. And we've now seen that figure stabilize for a sustained period at around 30%. In other words, this incentive led to a temporary 12-fold increase in the use of remote work during the pandemic and a more permanent 6-fold increase once the more acute moments had passed. And in other countries, you can see a very similar story unfolding. In the absence of this incentive, this new incentive, it would have taken simply decades for technologies to be developed and adopted in this direction, if it were possible for it to happen at all. Now, the infinite wages led not only to the adoption of existing technologies, but also the creation, of course, of entirely new technologies. And it's worth thinking, if we think about something like the vaccines that were developed during the pandemic. I remember working on vaccine policy right at the start and being told that it would be a decade at least before we had a vaccine. But in practice, we had 2 vaccines within 8 months. So I think, in short, and this is one of the big themes of the book, we shouldn't underestimate the power of incentives to shape or to direct the sorts of technological progress that takes place in society and the nature of economic growth that we enjoy as a result. We can change these incentives and change the types of technologies that get developed and change the type of growth that we enjoy if we want to. So that's one of the arguments, that we should use every tool that we have at our disposal to change the nature of growth. Taxes and subsidies, laws and regulations, social norms and cultures, and make that growth less destructive of the other things that we care about in society, whether it's a better environment, a more equal society, the availability of good work, a healthier politics, flourishing local places and communities. And in the book, I go through each of these different dimensions of the price of technological progress and the price of growth and explore how we might do that. But in the end, I think that we might have to accept the fact that we might not always be able to do this. And the final task is, I think, the hardest one of all, which is to ask, are we willing in those cases to sacrifice some growth, sacrifice some technological progress to protect other important outcomes that we care about? Now, in economics, as many of you will know, there are some who say that the way to resolve these issues is just to revise the GDP measure, to try and find ways of capturing the other valuable things that we care about, whether it's the state of the environment or the level of inequality in society, and that what we ought to do is sort of try and bundle all these measures together into a kind of more perfect GDP measure, a sort of GDP plus. And I think this is a mistake in thinking about how we deal with this challenge. And the reason I think it's a mistake is because these issues that I'm talking about are not technical questions about mismeasurement, but these are moral questions about what matters, about what other ends we value in society, if not simply the pursuit of technological progress and the pursuit of growth. And my argument is that these are the kind of questions that we need to return to politics. These are questions for citizens to answer. These questions about, again, what sort of things we might value, if not growth, and how much we ought to value them and how much we ought to balance them against one another. These are some of the hardest questions that we can ask, and they are going to invite immense disagreement. And in order to resolve that disagreement, in order to reach a sort of balanced dissatisfaction, I think we need political innovation to support greater citizen involvement, a wave of new institutions that could bring citizens together to debate these difficult questions again and again. And I think, I take a sort of encouragement from the rise of so-called mini publics around the world today. Things like citizens' assemblies, citizen juries, citizens' panels. You see them on the rise around OECD countries. And you see them being used to engage with some of the most difficult questions we can ask in some of the most difficult places you can ask them. So the issue of abortion in Ireland, the issue at the moment of euthanasia in France, the issue of energy policy, in particular whether to include nuclear as part of the energy mix in Korea. And these are the sorts of institutions I think we need now to engage with these difficult moral questions, these difficult trade-offs. These are not questions that can be answered, in my view, by statisticians and economists, but they need to be put back to citizens. So let me just finish on a note of optimism. And the book is fundamentally an optimistic one. As I think about the future, I am pretty hopeful. We live in an age of anxiety where every day, it seems, we get new stories of the existential risks that we face and sort of deflating reminders of our supposed incapacity to deal with them. But the argument that I want to make is an optimistic one, that we also, in a sense, have an existential opportunity in front of us. What I try and do is describe an opportunity that we now have for moral renewal, an opportunity to pay more attention to the other valuable ends that we might care about in society and that I think we might have neglected until now. And we can do so from a position of strength, looking into the future far more technologically capable and materially prosperous than ever before in our 300,000-year history. The late, great philosopher Derek Parfit had this once said, we have the power not only to make life good in decades to come, but to make it better in ways we now cannot even imagine. Nothing, in my view, could be more important than that. And how to do it is what this book is all about. So thank you very much. And I will finish there. And I look forward to hearing some reactions and taking some questions. Thank you.
We have a question from Sandy.
What would be really helpful as well if you say who you are and what you do, just so I can put the question in context. That'd be great.
Sandy Pentland, here at High, also at MIT for a long time. So first comment is, I also was the UN Secretary General's data revolutionary to try and put together the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals, including GDP.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that's interesting about that is that they were never intended to be combined into one measurement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because different cultures have very different ideas about this.
Yes.
So that's the politics part of it.
Yeah.
But I would encourage you in thinking about these things to notice that we got 192 different countries to agree that here are the 17 features that you combine when you try to do future policy.
Yeah.
That's one thing. Second thing, I had the opportunity and was part of a large-scale evaluation of the 3,500 incubators in China.
Yeah.
And in that program, the government incentivized creation of new ideas, creation of new technology. And they did it in terms of educating people more, giving them more, all the things you would imagine. In the analysis, none of those things were predictive of success. The only thing that was predictive of success was the surrounding social support, the network of other innovators, the network of communications, things like that. So the ideas had to do with interaction with other people. And I think that that's a theme. I didn't hear it strongly in what you said. I'm sure you believe that at some level. But it was really interesting that the straightforward model of innovation didn't seem to be significant.
Yeah.
Right? It really was having supportive people around you, people who had tried other things, and that sort of community discussion.
Yeah. Can I ask just on that first comment that you made? What was the sort of, how did the process work for finding?
So the Millennium Development Goals.
I'm familiar. Right? I'm interested in the sort of the process.
One of the major conclusions that everybody bought into is if you don't measure it, it isn't going to happen.
Yeah. And
so they had to come up with a list of things, which they wanted to be around 12, but that didn't work, that everybody could agree with.
Yeah.
And that's the list of things they came up with. And of course, it's not perfect, but the process was one of repeated discussion about what mattered and what they could sell to all the different. They wanted to get unanimity.
Yeah.
And then some of the big guys came in at the end and said, "Here's 2 or 3 others that we have to have in there." Tough, right?
Yeah.
And that was the process. So is that what you mean?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, my view is that in thinking about the challenges of now, rather than that we need to go even.
Well, my point with this is just personal frustration is we have a starting point.
Yeah.
Everybody says, "Well, here's a list."
Yeah.
You may not like it, you could fix it, right? But it is something where it says, here are the things that you might want to have as front and center, and different cultures will combine them differently. And the fact that everybody sort of was willing to put their hand up and vote for it, I think is a major fact. Because you 15 years ago, you would never have guessed that you could get all the countries to agree that inequality was a problem, that ocean health was a problem. I mean, but they agreed.
Yeah, and so the vision that I set out in the book is kind of in agreement with what you're describing, except it's even more participative. I think the people who need to be involved now in these discussions are not simply the political leaders, who I think have an important role, but citizens as well. We need to go to an even more granular level in hashing out.
In my view, the Sustainable Development Goals give you air cover.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's like, well, let's talk about what that really means, right? And then you're right, at a much more granular level.
Interesting. Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, right here.
Ines Suleiman's postdoc at the law school in international trade. So my question is related to trade. To what extent do your thoughts on degrowth also apply to arguments on decoupling and deglobalization? Because you use the example of the Chinese, the solar cells,
yes,
which are now almost exclusively produced in China.
Yes.
The EU completely lost its competitive edge there, which raises concerns about national security. So I'm wondering just to what extent these kinds of arguments have been considered in.
Yeah, I mean, those sorts of themes appear a lot in the book. You know, one of the big prices to growth, it seems to me, has been as a result of the pursuit of growth through globalization, and that the result for particular local places and communities which had industries which were destroyed by or went into decline because of that pursuit, that there is a big price for those communities and places. It's not simply an economic price, which is the one that I think many economists appreciated in sort of models and stories that they told about trade, that there would be distributional issues, there'd be winners and losers, and we needed to find a way to sort of reallocate the kind of gains from trade, but also issues around meaning and purpose too. That work and particular industries are not simply a source of an income, but also a source of shared purpose and community and meaning. And when those industries went into decline, you not only hollowed out the labor market in those places, but you also hollowed out that sense of meaning and direction and fulfillment. And I think that tension between, again, growth through globalization and then the kind of health and flourishing local place and communities is a really difficult one. And in the UK with Brexit, we've kind of been on the sort of front line of that trade-off, that tension. I think there are, there's also, if I think again about the sort of UK setting, you mentioned the fact that solar panels are, many of them developed in China. I mean, if you were to ask the question, what is the best thing that the UK could do at the moment, or small but nevertheless influential countries could do to tackle climate change? We don't have enough people that changing our behavior will make a big difference to climate change in sort of 20, 30 years. But one of the big things I think we could do is around technology transfer, allowing the kind of free flow of ideas about how we develop these technologies from places like the UK to other parts of the world. So I think there's an interesting story there about how people have impact. But these sorts of international questions run through the book in lots of different ways. I think they're really important.
I want to pick up a little bit on the degrowth, so the measurement. And there does seem to be sort of when I hear the degrowthers and pro-growthers debate, it seems like sometimes it's a bit of a measurement semantic thing. And you said it was not a semantic measurement thing, so I want to understand better. Like if Nicholas Stern or others say that climate change could cost $1 trillion worth of damage, but it would cost $400 billion to mitigate that. That $400 billion is a cost to growth. But wouldn't a better way to say it is that it would be a $600 billion benefit to growth? That you'd be $600 billion better off if you took these actions than if you didn't. And the only reason it's not measured that way, it's not count that way, is we're not measuring the cost of climate change. If we counted the environmental costs as well as the economic, number of television sets produced, included all of those costs and benefits, then there wouldn't really be much of a debate. It would be like, okay, which one creates more value? And so if you leave part of the costs out of your measure, then you have to resort to moralizing and saying, well, we have to absorb these other economic costs for this moral imperative. But if you were to count them all, then it's no longer a moral thing. It's more of a technical question about how do you maximize the value created.
And I think so I think Nicholas Stern would now agree with you that he would say that actually exactly as you say, that it would,
it seems like bad framing to say this cost us, we're going to be poorer.
Yeah.
Actually, we're going to be wealthier because you have to count all the costs.
So my issue is not that, and this is, the argument I'm making is not that the environment is not something that we ought to value. The argument I'm making is that it's a mistake to do the sort of merging that you're talking about. And the reason is quite important, which is I think that act of merging itself involves very difficult moral questions about how, firstly, there's the question, what do we merge? The environment might be, relatively unassailable as a sort of objective, although there is lots of disagreement about whether it's something we ought to value. But then there's moral questions about what we include, but then there are also moral questions about how we balance them up. What are the weights for these different things that we care about? And those questions, it seems to me, capture really difficult moral disagreements. And those aren't disagreements that I think can be resolved from a sort of technical point of view. The kind of input into determining what goes into the sort of objective function and what weights we attach to those things, or the social welfare function, whatever, however you want to think about it, needs to be informed by politics, not by economics.
Yeah, I mean, just to flesh that a little bit, there are certainly some things that are way at that end of the spectrum and it's very easy to measure. And it seems that a useful agenda is how many of these things can we measure? What is the damage to coastlines, or what is going to happen to crop production? Some of those are, they're not necessarily easy, but they're basically technical questions about what the cost is. And we should try to answer those questions.
Yes, yeah.
There's some other moral things about the who bears the cost, and how that's allocated and other things. But it seems like a useful agenda would be to take as much off of the moral side of the equation, which is inherently hard to be analytical about. There's people who are better at it than I am, but I think it's mostly pretty hard. And over to the numbers end of the equation, where some things are, and a lot of the past couple hundred years has been a program to quantify more and more things. You take, more recently, acid rain. They had cap and trade. They said, okay, we're going to, at first it was a lot of moralizing about acid rain, and then they said, okay, let's implement ways of measuring this and quantifying it and put it cap and trade, and basically solve the problem, which is nice. It's not always that easy.
Yeah.
Or even just going back further, can we think of capital as an input, not just land and labor? And how do you measure capital? There's big accounting literature on, accounting for intangibles. And
of course,
I'm not saying it's easy, but there's a research program to try to quantify things that we previously had over in this ineffable side of the ledger. And not that everything's going to be able to be like that, but I wouldn't be. It's interesting to just think about how much you can do to make those adjustments, and thereby have this discussion be more based on sort of analytical debates rather than moral debates.
Yeah, and so and I understand exactly what you're saying. I mean, what I argue for in the work is a kind of GDP minimalism. That I think the purpose of GDP should just be to simply value the activity that takes place, the economic activity that takes place in a market. And we ought to recognize, and we ought to do all the kind of technical fixes to make it as strong a value as we can of that activity. But the fact that we don't value free things as an issue, the fact that we are bad at valuing quality as an issue, and we ought to, those are the kind of technical problems that we ought to resolve. But then when you're thinking about other sorts of activity, and I take what you're saying, that there are some things in the, some environmental things where it's possible to value those things by thinking about the sort of economic impact. But then if you start moving to other costs, whether it's, say, the level of inequality in society, how to measure that, how then to include those measures in a sort of GDP plus measure, I think involves really difficult moral questions that it's not for. If you want those measures to be kind of legitimate, it's not for technical experts to decide. That's the thrust of the argument.
That's why the Sustainable Development Goals didn't give a recipe for putting all those values together, because different groups are going to have very different attitudes about it.
That's right.
And one of the things that's actually I observe is that different groups are thinking about it, certainly at the national level and at the province level. But it's all, how can I make my country, my province better, and not how it fits with other people. So it's not a joint optimization problem where they actually talk about this stuff with each other. It's all like, oh, I could do this, and then we'll do really well. And we've moved all those pain over to the neighboring country, right? It's like everybody's trying to sort of solve it locally where they come out up on top.
I mean, just to kind of point to another kind of aspect of the price of growth, Eric, that's kind of closer to conversations we've had in the past. If you think about work, some might say we ought to capture a sort of measure of participation in the labor market or unemployment, and that's a useful thing to be, but I think there are really difficult questions about the kind of moral value of work. I think, and whether or not work is perhaps today it's for various reasons a good thing, but you can imagine 50 years from now that actually people are able to get an income from elsewhere, find meaning and purpose and fulfillment elsewhere. It's not obvious that that's a useful, traditional measures like participation, unemployment aren't necessarily useful things to bundle into a kind of into a sort of single metric. And again, I think there are really interesting moral questions about what else we ought to value, if not simply the activity that takes place in a market, and how much we ought to value those things. That I want sort of out in the open for people to be disagreeing about. Yes.
Yeah, great. My question is related to something Chad Jones. The business school. Your use of the phrase "work threatening" I found very interesting. In typical economic models, work is a bad, leisure is good, and work reducing, leisure producing technological change might be a good thing. So in some sense, that 200-year period that you were highlighting, the vertical growth on your graph, that entire period is capital replacing labor, right? So from the looms and the textile mills to so in some sense we've been doing a lot of that. And as Keynes wrote a long time ago about the economics of our grandchildren and how they don't have to work at all. His grandchildren, exactly. In some sense, I go back and forth in my own mind about this. I think it's tricky. I think a lot of the work that we do is incredibly meaningful. We would all do it if we had a basic income and didn't need the money. That's the kind of work you want people to do. That's the meaningful work. The work that you do, construction in the sunshine, raising tobacco farm as a kid, which is what I did. That was miserable work. I learned I didn't want to do that.
Yes.
Getting rid of the bad work and giving people choices. And in some sense, Star Trek, they had infinite resources that work, but they found meaning and they did work. It seems like that's the kind of work you want. But taxing computers and software seems like not the right way to go.
Yeah. So I should say it's very nice to meet you in person. Your work is sort of throughout the book. So thank you very much for that. I mean, it is this great, and it's something I've written about, this great mismatch between how economists write about work in their formal models and then how they talk about it in public debate and discussion. And it's one of the things that I've really tried to poke at, which is particularly the work that's being done at MIT at the moment on this. Both David Autor and Darren Acemoglu talk about work and meaning as if there is a very strong relationship between them, and that a world without paid work is a sort of ungovernable world, in part because you lose that. Not only it's not only a sort of income distribution mechanism, but it's also a source of meaning and purpose. And one of the things I've tried to do in my work is point out two things. One is that there's a lot of heterogeneity, exactly as you say, that if you look at polls today, lots of people do not get meaning and purpose from their work. Lots of people, if they had the choice, would rather not work at all. Than now, that's not an argument that the kind of good work, you shouldn't then sort of pursue the kind of good work that you're talking to, but it is an argument that work in itself is not necessarily. But it's also the case that if you look at very different societies over time, you get very different relationships between work and meaning. So if you go back to sort of ancient Athens or Thebes, you have very different relationships between work and meaning. Work is thought of as being a kind of prohibitively grubby thing that you don't want to do. You find meaning and purpose through politics and other types of activity. So the point being that I think this relationship between work and meaning is far less well determined than many people talk about it, either in formal models or in kind of public conversation. And I think it raises really difficult moral questions that we need to be talking about, and we need to get citizens involved in. I don't think it's as clear as saying we ought to be necessarily trying to steer technology in a direction that makes sure there's paid work for everyone to do. I don't think that's necessarily clear. I agree with you as well on this observation about there's a kind of question of sort of political economy about if you think about climate change, that's a really good example of how for 50 years we have it's an example of a technology that two types of technology. It can be dirty, it can be clean, and for 50 years we've known if we have a carbon tax of around $100 per metric ton of carbon by 2030, then we'll be able to encourage people to develop clean technologies, not dirty ones. And it's an example of where we could have directed technological progress, and we have made some progress, but we haven't done anywhere nearly enough. And so we have a situation where we both got to, we've tried to mitigate, but we've also now got to adapt. With automation and work, you've got the problem of not only the kind of political economy, but you've also got the sort of technical problem, which is that ex ante, it's not always obvious which technologies are going to necessarily complement or substitute. And that relationship might change over time. It's just, it's a far more difficult problem. And, when I've spoken to computer scientists about it, conversations with Stuart Russell in particular, have just, he sort of laughs at the idea that you could, ex ante, know what particular technologies you want to be subsidizing, which you want to be taxing in order to achieve some particular. So I think, lots of interesting observations there. Thank you.
A couple of questions from online here. Yeah. So I'm just going to bundle a couple of them. Rogerio Soares says, less developed countries don't have the resources to invest more in R&D. How can we increase productivity in these countries? And Alex Parkamenko thanks you for your clear and concise lecture and says, can you help us estimate the potential for more economic growth and which breakthroughs in which fields were most likely to accelerate growth? So he means more broadly, not just in LDCs, but you can talk about either or both.
Yeah. On that first question, I think one part of the story that I didn't talk about was the role of human beings and human capital in driving growth. So I think that's a big part of the the 20th century for many parts of the developed world was the human capital century. What drove growth was wave after wave of getting people into more education, first primary, then secondary, then more and more advanced. And I think that story of skills and capabilities is probably, and investing in human capital is probably one of the most important parts of the story for thinking about less developed countries. And I write about that a lot in the book. You just repeat that second question, not entirely.
Sure. Well, he thanks you for your...
Thank you for repeating. Yeah.
Oh, the other part. Okay.
I got that.
Can you estimate the potential for economic growth and breakthroughs in which fields will accelerate growth the most?
So a question about which particular fields.
One way to interpret it, you gave the last thing was technologies that could be a contributor as well. So
I do. One of the kind of fields that I'm most excited about in thinking about growth in the 21st century is the field of sort of technology-based idea discovery. Until now, many of the best ideas about the world have come from meat machines, from our heads. Creativity has been a sort of uniquely human domain. The thing I'm excited about is the prospect that that ideas might come not from human beings and meat machines, but from these silicon machines. And so that, I think, is the sort of nascent
and working together.
Yeah, all them working together. Yeah, for a time, but it does seem to me that the prospect that these technologies might either help human beings discover more ideas, and I think that is particularly important in thinking about the decline of research productivity. Making human beings more productive at discovering ideas is a useful prospect for these technologies. But there's also the more radical proposition: these technologies themselves might generate ideas, and that I think is what particularly excites me.
Great. I think we have time for one more quick question. Anyone? No? Okay. Well, let's wrap up.
Yep.
Thanks very much, Daniel. I really appreciate you coming all the way over from the UK. That was a terrific talk. And your book is available now on Amazon?
Yeah, just now. Yeah.
Okay. So look for the book on Amazon now. And please join us next week, or actually June 3rd, when we have Michael Jacobides, who will be talking about expectations for Gen AI's impact on sectoral dynamics, business models, and competitive advantage. Thanks again, Daniel.